Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions, and today's opinions will be about The Deep Dark River by Hannah Kate Stallo. Okay, so I will admit, when I started reading this one, I got a little bit worried that I might not be able to do a review for it, and I was panicking, going, oh god, what am I gonna do to fill in that week's slot? But I'll get to that. This book is the story of the river god Tetch, the third son of the Mississippi River, and the two humans who will help him solve his own murder. We start with Todd Finley, a young man who finds himself at loose ends in New Orleans and ends up stepping onto a streetcar that should not exist. This is a streetcar for the spirits of New Orleans, and on it he meets a man calling himself Silas. Silas has been recently murdered, and after hearing that Todd enjoys Agatha Christie novels and has an almost photographic memory, he convinces Todd to help him figure out who killed him before the murderer can try again. Todd convinces Silas to ask for help from a police officer who happens to be the brother of the beautiful young painter/voodoo witch that Silas has been pining after, Florence Hawkins. Together they will have to stop whoever is trying to kill Silas before the murderer can kill everything spiritual in New Orleans. So I'm gonna get this out of the way first and foremost. The reason I was worried about reviewing this one is because it is indie published, and it's pretty damn obvious that this book did not get the spit and polish that traditionally published books are supposed to get. There are a lot of typos, there are formatting mistakes, there are far too many adjectives and creative dialogue tags, and there's the kind of repetition that a professional line editor would have knocked out of the manuscript. But if you can look past all those honestly petty things, you will find an absolutely charming, fun, evocative book. First of all, I loved the characters, though the author did feel the need to tell us who they were a bit too much. Like, I get that Silas is the traditionally charming, ne'er-do-well Cajun. You don't need to keep telling me. We can see it in the way he talks, in the different stories that he tells, in the ways the other characters respond to him. Like, you don't have to convince us. But, like, Todd was sweet and the kind of character who the second I met him, I wanted him to have a happy ending. Florence was playful and feisty and believably flawed. Halada was honestly my favorite character in the entire damn book, and all I can say about him is I want to see more of him. And there were a lot of really fun, really minor characters that are the kind of characters that when you see them on the page, you know the author knows exactly who they are, even though as a reader you're only spending like half a page with them. I also thought the author did an absolutely great job of imbibing every single scene with the feeling of New Orleans. A lot of books that I've read that have been set in New Orleans honestly feel a little bit kitschy. This city has a certain reputation for spirituality, spookiness, and mystery that it's like candy to fantasy and horror authors. So a lot of people will set books in New Orleans, and sometimes it feels like they're trying a bit too hard, like they're trying so hard to capture the feeling of the city that they push straight forward into the land of every single X-Men cartoon's bad accent of Gambit. Like, that level of it's too far. A lot of the books set in New Orleans feel like something you would really only buy in a tourist shop in the French Quarter. And fun fact, if you want a book that you can buy in a tourist shop in the French Quarter, I wrote one. But that's besides the point. I feel like this author actually really deeply understands what makes New Orleans feel magical. And that magic was so thoroughly entangled with the story and the themes of the book that New Orleans feels like not just a character, New Orleans feels like the POV character in this book. We're sort of seeing everything through the lens of New Orleans. And especially once we get to the Mystic, I thought that it was all wonderful and creative and both deeply New Orleans while also being like otherworldly and weird. My only complaint with the way this setting is handled is I honestly wanted a little bit more setting descriptions. I want to see more of this author's vision of New Orleans. Oh, and also there's one random moment where Central Grocery is on the wrong street, and literally the only reason I know that is because I walk by Central Grocery every single day that I work. I do also need to mention that for a while I was a little bit confused because it took me about 50 pages to realize that this was a period piece. Like, it is set in the 1920s, and I didn't get that. Todd honestly just came across to me as a bit of a hipster. And, like, Silas is described as wearing very, you know, old-timey clothes, but he's also described as otherworldly and different, so I thought it was just him being weird. And, like, all the set dressing of New Orleans that is used in those first 50 pages are things that still exist! Like, the streetcars still go down Canal. You can still go to Café du Monde for a beignet at any point. Like, all of this is normal. Jazz bands still randomly play in the streets. You can still buy fruits and vegetables on the side of the road. That's just New Orleans! So it took me embarrassingly long to cotton on that this was meant to be set in the 1920s, a full century ago. And I think that says as much about New Orleans as it does this book. But there are also just so many things I really liked about this book. For one, the voice is very interesting, and I did have a little bit of a preview of the voice because I follow the author on TikTok, and yeah, this book is written the way the author speaks on TikTok. And I will warn you that part of what makes the author's voice so interesting is word choice. Like, she uses words in ways that are not technically correct. And most of the time this reads very clearly as a obvious choice, not a mistake. And it feels very New Orleans to me. People here are very creative with how they interpret vocabulary in specifically, like, where you put the words in sentences often is a bit different in New Orleans, and I think that stems from the fact that a lot of the people here, a lot of the dialects here stem from people who spoke both French and English, and French organizes sentences differently. So a lot of people, especially those who live on the outskirts of New Orleans, the actual Cajuns, yeah, they just interpret sentences in a different way. And that means that there are words that are just what we would normally think of as the wrong part of speech. One example that came up repeatedly is the author had characters sighing in relinquish. And yeah, that's not standard American English, but it's still very clear what we're talking about, and it's a kind of creativity that I associate with Southern Louisiana. Also, the author captured the long-winded, tangential looseness that I recognize from the way that Cajuns tell stories. Everything needs a backstory. There are random songs. Sometimes odd things are just sort of happening, and people are weirdly accepting of the wild and off the wall. It honestly feels an awful lot like sitting on a bus in New Orleans and listening to people tell each other stories. Though I will warn you, this leads to some odd pacing in the book. It's not unusual for characters to fall in love, find unending friendships, and have their world completely turned upside down in a couple of days in books. Like, this is pretty normal. But it was a lot more noticeable in this book than it is in a lot of them. And I think part of that is because there's too much continuous storytelling. Like, we don't have the illusion that a lot is happening off page because almost every minute of the book pretty much is on page. Which is, those moments off page are often how the authors of those narratives where too much happens makes it feel like less is happening, if that makes sense. Like, if you leave a gap in the narrative, we have time to imagine the characters doing whatever they need to in that time. Like, we can get in our imagination, like, several days worth of getting to know you shit, when truthfully, on the page, it acknowledges there's only, like, 2 hours that we're not seeing. But, sometimes you just need those gaps to let the audience imagine what's happening. One example in this particular book is, like, after the conversation in Café du Monde, if the author had just said that Silas spent the day showing Todd New Orleans, we could imagine all the getting to know you time that we needed for their bond to develop. But instead we spend almost every second of that time on page until we meet Florence. And so we just don't have any time to play with their relationship developing. And basically I just needed a little bit more time skipping to give the characters' feelings time to develop. Though also, there's a portion of this book in the center of the book that is just all about the characters' feelings developing. Like, it's just the plot sort of stops and they just have emotions. And it comes right after a moment of very serious, aggressive foreshadowing and like shit's about to go down. We've started to deal with a problem, stopped in the middle, have lots of feels, and it's like 100 pages before suddenly we remember, oh, there's an existential threat that we should probably be dealing with. And I feel like maybe that one could be fixed literally just by having one more run-in with the cultist in the middle there, but, you know, it's still fun, and objectively the relationships are what I like most about this book, so I wasn't mad. My only other big qualm about this book is that Todd doesn't get enough to do in the book. Like, he's our first POV character. He's our introduction to this world, and the other characters keep telling him that he's important to the narrative. But honestly, the only thing he really does in the entire book is encourage Silas to go talk to Florence, and later he brings them some research that they do nothing with. I feel like a couple of really easy changes could fix this. Have him find the church with his research instead of letting Florence do it, because she's gonna have plenty to do later on in the book. And also, I would have loved if the scene in the graveyard, Todd had like had a run-in with the cultists, like he almost got there in time, instead of just it being the moment where the characters sort of meet back up. But as is, he feels a little bit like he's just there to be the observer. And specifically, he's there to be our uninformed POV. And this is a trick that's used in a lot of media where there's some unusual world building that will need a lot of explanation. You introduce a character who knows nothing about the world so that all the other characters have an excuse to explain things to them. And in so doing, explain things to the audience. And Todd is objectively perfect for that. He's not from New Orleans, he's not from the South, he knows nothing of voodoo or magic or spirits or the mystic, though ironically he does have book knowledge of one of the legends of Bayou Teche, and that's worked in the narrative, but he works as a perfect exposition target for the other characters to exposit to. But I want a bit more from him than that. And also we don't really need an exposition target, because we have a loose omniscient POV here. This book is written in a semi-omniscient third person, as in we are constantly flowing between the three main characters' heads. And honestly, once I was used to it, I really liked it. It made them feel more close naturally and more interconnected, which was really necessary considering how short of a timeline this book is on. Like, this is literally like 3 or 4 days. And it made the fact that they were ready to die for each other after having known each other for 3 days feel natural. Because, like, of course they are so deeply connected, they practically live in each other's thoughts. Also, it allows us to see every scene as both an outsider and an insider at the same time. Like, we are seeing how these emotions look on the people, but we're also seeing how they feel. And it made for a really endearing read. But objectively, what made this book really enjoyable to me, even when the writing got a little bit rougher, was the soul of the book. So much of this book is about the specific, special, accepting spirituality of New Orleans, and how it stands in direct contrast to the harsh, judgmental evangelicals. It's about loving and forgiving and accepting yourself, about how justice is not always kind, and about not judging people on your assumptions. There's a welcoming feeling to this book that really captures exactly why I love New Orleans, why I moved to New Orleans. So yeah, I very much enjoyed this book. Even though, yeah, it honestly needed one more edit. But like, honestly, the reason I felt the urge to pull out a editing pen and start making typographical marks in this book is because there is such a gem hidden under the slightly rough exterior. So yeah, as long as you're a person who is able to look past a few typos, this is a book I would suggest.